Gunshot victims, shattered bones, and the desperately dying were standard fare for the sliding doors of Street Jude's emergency room. What wasn't standard was a four-man Black Ops element, drenched in freezing rain and covered in arterial blood, breaching the triage area with terrifying military precision. Bypassing the screaming doctors and frantic security guards, these heavily armed phantoms ignored the chaos they created. Their eyes locked on a single target, Abigail Foster, the quiet, mousy night shift nurse currently organizing IV bags in the corner. When the hulking team leader dropped to one knee before her, the entire ER fell dead silent. Street Jude's Memorial Hospital sat in the gritty, neon-lit underbelly of Seattle, a sprawling concrete sanctuary that caught the city's broken pieces when they fell. The graveyard shift in the emergency department was a relentless meat grinder of overdoses, violent trauma, and shattered lives. It was an environment that broke seasoned medical professionals, burning them out and spitting them back into private practice within a few years. Then, there was Nurse Abigail Foster. Abigail had appeared on the HR roster 18 months ago, slipping into the ecosystem of Street Jude so quietly that most of the staff didn't realize she was there until her second week. She was entirely unassuming, pale, slight, with dishwater blonde hair perpetually pulled into a severe, utilitarian bun. She wore oversized scrubs that hid her frame and thick, wire-rimmed glasses that obscured pale blue eyes. She spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, never engaged in the crude, dark humor the ER staff used as a coping mechanism, and never, under any circumstances, joined them for early morning drinks at O'Malley's pub after a grueling 12-hour shift. Dr. Thorin Rivera, the attending trauma surgeon, was a man who prided himself on observation. He had spent 2 tours in Kandahar as an army surgeon before settling in Seattle, and he knew how to read people under pressure. Abigail fascinated him, primarily because she didn't react like a normal human being. It was mid-November when Thorin first caught a glimpse of the anomaly beneath the mousy exterior. A massive multi-car pileup on Interstate 5 had flooded the ER with critical patients. The linoleum floors were slick with blood. Monitors were screaming in a deafening chorus, and the triage nurses were overwhelmed. Thorin was up to his elbows in the chest cavity of a crushed truck driver when the man's pressure bottomed out, a tension pneumothorax. The lung had collapsed, trapping air in the pleural space and crushing the heart. "I need a chest tube set up now," Thorin bellowed, the sweat stinging his eyes. "He's coding." Brenda Hopkins, the veteran charge nurse, was tied up with a pediatric code 2 beds down. The resident assisting Thorin froze, paralyzed by the sudden, catastrophic deterioration of the patient. Before Thorin could shout again, a gloved hand slid into his peripheral vision. It wasn't frantic. It was smooth, economical, and unnervingly steady. A large-bore needle was passed precisely into Thorin's palm, positioned perfectly for immediate insertion. He didn't have time to look up. He jammed the needle into the second intercostal space. A hiss of trapped air escaped, and the heart monitor immediately stabilized into a rhythmic, steady beep. Thorin exhaled sharply, looking up to see who had anticipated his exact need with such flawless timing. Abigail was already stepping back, silently gathering the bloody wrappers and disposing of them. "Good catch, Foster," Thorin said, his voice rough with adrenaline. Abigail didn't smile. She didn't seek the praise. She simply gave a curt, almost mechanical nod, her eyes scanning the room for the next crisis before fading back into the chaotic blur of the ER. That night, Thorin watched her from the nurse's station. She was suturing a laceration on a belligerent, intoxicated, homeless man. The man was thrashing, screaming profanities, and spitting. Most nurses would have called for security restraints. Abigail didn't. She leaned in, her voice low, murmuring something into the man's ear. Thorin couldn't hear the words, but the effect was instantaneous. The man stopped thrashing. His eyes went wide, filled not with calm, but with a sudden, primal realization of danger. He sat perfectly still, while Abigail finished the stitches with a speed and precision that made Thorin's military-trained eyes narrow. "She's a weird one, isn't she?" Brenda Hopkins said, handing Thorin a lukewarm coffee. "Where did she come from?" Thorin asked, watching Abigail pack up her medical tray. "Midwest somewhere." "Indiana, I think," Brenda replied, shrugging. "HR said her paperwork was spotless. I don't care where she's from, Tommy. She takes the worst shifts. She never complains. And she never panics. She's an angel. A weird, creepy little angel." Thorin took a sip of the bitter coffee. "Have you ever noticed how she walks?" Brenda frowned. "What do you mean?" "She doesn't make a sound. She heel-to-toes it. It's a tactical glide, and she never stands with her back to the doors." Brenda laughed, patting Thorin on the shoulder. "You're reading too much into it, G.I. Joe. Not everyone is a secret agent. Some people are just profoundly introverted." But Thorin couldn't shake the feeling. He had seen that type of hypervigilance before. He had seen it in Tier 1 operators returning from the sandbox. Men and women whose nervous systems were permanently wired to anticipate a threat. Abigail Foster wasn't an introverted girl from Indiana. She was a ghost, hiding in plain sight. The cracks in Abigail's carefully constructed facade began to show 3 weeks later. A gang dispute in the Rainier Valley spilled over into the hospital when a young man was dumped out of a moving sedan at the ambulance bay. He was bleeding profusely from a gunshot wound to the right shoulder. Thorin and Abigail caught the patient. As they stripped away the blood-soaked jacket in Trauma Bay 1, Thorin inspected the wound. It was nasty, a clean entry, but the exit wound was jagged and massive. "Looks like a standard 9mm, probably hollow point given the exit cavity," Thorin noted, calling for saline and packing gauze. Abigail, applying pressure to the brachial artery, spoke without thinking. "No, the entry wound is too small, and the powder stippling suggests a high-velocity round fired from close range. 5,5 nato, probably a short-barreled rifle, suppressed given the unburned powder residue." The trauma bay went completely silent. The resident, the respiratory therapist, and Thorin all stopped and stared at the mousy nurse, holding pressure on the wound. Abigail froze. A flash of genuine panic, the first emotion Thorin had ever seen her display, flickered in her eyes. She blinked rapidly, her shoulders slumping instantly as she forced her posture back into that of a timid nurse. I watch a lot of true crime documentaries," she stammered, her voice trembling slightly. "Sorry, Dr. Rivera. I shouldn't have spoken out of turn." Thorin didn't buy a single syllable of it. "Right," he said slowly, never taking his eyes off her. "Let's get him up to OR." That evening, Thorin couldn't let it go. Sitting in his cramped office, he logged into the hospital's secure database and pulled up Abigail Foster's file. Just as Brenda had said, it was spotless. Nursing degree from a small, reputable college in the Midwest. Outstanding references. But as Thorin looked closer, the perfection itself became the anomaly. There were no commendations, no disciplinary actions, no minor gaps in employment. It was a sterile, two-dimensional profile. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 2 years. "Greg," Thorin said when the line connected. "Tommy Rivera," came the booming voice of Greg Harrison, an old college roommate who now worked as an intelligence analyst for a 3-letter agency in D.C. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Someone finally shoot you?" "I need a favor," Thorin said, keeping his voice low. "I need you to run a background check on someone. Deep dive. I'm not your private investigator, Tommy. I track international arms dealers. Just this once, Greg. Her name is Abigail Foster. Social Security number." He read off the digits from her file. He heard the clacking of a keyboard on the other end. "All right, let's see what we have. Abigail Foster, Indiana, nursing degree. Tommy, this is a parking ticket waiting to happen. She's nobody. Dig deeper," Thorin insisted. "Run the SSN through the federal databases." A minute of silence passed. The clacking stopped. "Greg?" When Greg spoke again, all the humor was gone from his voice. "Tommy, Where are you right now? In my office at the hospital. Why? Listen to me very carefully, Greg said, his tone dead serious. Do not look into this woman. Do not ask her questions. Do not speak her name on an unencrypted line again. Thorin felt a chill run down his spine. What did you find? I didn't find anything. That's the problem. The moment I ran her biometrics and SSN through the National Crime Information Center, my screen locked. I just got a level 5 Department of Defense red flag. A literal pop-up telling me my query has been logged and flagged by the Pentagon. The Pentagon? Thorin whispered. Tommy, I don't know who this woman is, but she's not a nurse. The kind of digital firewall protecting her identity is reserved for high-value assets. Ghosts, people who are either in witness protection for taking down cartels, or people who have done things for the government that don't exist on any books. Drop this, now. Greg hung up, 3 miles away, in a Spartan, 1-bedroom apartment in the industrial district. The woman known as Abigail Foster sat in the dark. Her real name was Cassandra Hayes. And until 3 years ago, she was the lead field medic and tactical extraction specialist for Echo 7, a classified JSOC task force operating off the grid. The apartment was pitch black, illuminated only by the amber glow of the street lamps slicing through the blinds. She sat on the floor, stripping and cleaning a matte black Glock 19 with practiced, methodical precision. There was no furniture, save for a mattress on the floor and a heavily reinforced door with 3 deadbolts. A packed canvas go-bag sat by the window. She closed her eyes, and the memories she fought so hard to bury clawed their way to the surface. The biting cold of the Ukrainian border, the smell of pine and cordite, the deafening roar of the RPG that tore through their extraction chopper. She remembered the blood on the snow. She remembered dragging her commanding officer through the freezing mud while the mercenary syndicate, led by a man named Sterling, closed in on them. She had stayed behind to hold the choke point. She had taken 2 rounds to the Kevlar and 1 to the thigh. She had fought until her rifle clicked empty, buying her team exactly 4 minutes to reach the secondary extraction point. When the drone strike finally leveled the forest, leveling the mercenaries with it, the brass had presumed her dead. She let them believe it. Cassandra Hayes was a liability. The syndicate had put a multi-million-dollar bounty on her head for disrupting their supply chain. So, Cassandra died in the snow, and Abigail Foster was born in the neon rain of Seattle. She snapped the slide of the Glock back into place. Today, she had slipped. The 5.56 millimeters comment. She had seen Dr. Rivera's eyes. He knew she was a fraud. It was time to run again. She couldn't afford to be exposed. Not when Sterling's people were still out there. She stood up, placing the weapon in her holster. She would work one last shift tonight, clear out her locker, and disappear before dawn. The storm hit Seattle with a vengeance just past midnight. It was a torrential Pacific Northwest squall, a wall of wind and freezing rain that knocked out transformers across the grid. Street 72 per. Jude's flickered, plunged into darkness for 10 terrifying seconds before the heavy diesel backup generators kicked in, bathing the ER in a dull, yellowish emergency light. The waiting room was a madhouse of panicked civilians, seeking shelter from the storm, and an influx of weather-related traumas. Thorin Rivera was exhausted. He was elbow-deep in a complex shoulder dislocation when the heavy, reinforced sliding glass doors of the ambulance bay blew entirely off their tracks. The sound was like a bomb going off. The wind howled into the triage area, sending paperwork and medical supplies flying like shrapnel. Security guards rushed forward, hands on their pepper spray, shouting for order. Through the howling rain, 4 massive figures strode into the harsh yellow light. They weren't paramedics. They were dressed in unmarked, charcoal gray tactical gear. Plate carriers, drop-leg holsters, communication headsets, and compact submachine guns slung tightly against their chests. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity, Water poured off their gear, pooling on the linoleum. In the center of the formation, 2 of the men were carrying a 5th. He was a mountain of a man, his tactical vest completely shredded, exposing a torso slick with dark arterial blood. The hospital erupted into screams. Patients scrambled under chairs. Nurses backed away, terrified. "Hey, you can't bring weapons in here," shouted Gary, a burly, overzealous hospital security guard, stepping directly into the path of the lead operator. The team leader, a man with graying temples, a scarred jawline, and eyes like chipped flint, didn't even break stride. He reached out, grabbed Gary by the wrist and the tactical belt, and used the guard's own momentum to effortlessly flip him into a row of plastic waiting chairs. He didn't unholster his weapon. He just removed the obstacle. "Clear the bay!" the leader roared, his voice cutting through the panic like a foghorn. "We need a trauma bed, right goddamn now!" Thorin stepped out of his cubicle, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had seen operators like this in Afghanistan. These weren't cops. These were Tier 1 assets, and they were terrified. "I'm the attending surgeon," Thorin said, holding his hands up placatingly as he approached. "Bring him to Trauma 1. What's the injury?" "GSW to the right abdomen. Shattered the pelvis. Severed the femoral," shouted one of the men carrying the wounded soldier. "We packed it with hemostatic gauze, but he's bleeding through." They slammed the massive man down onto the trauma bed. Thorin moved in, snapping on fresh gloves. The wounded man's face was chalky white, his lips blue. "He's in hypovolemic shock," Thorin said, grabbing trauma shears to cut away the rest of the gear. "I need 4 units of O-negative on a rapid infuser." Someone paged the on-call vascular surgeon, but the ER staff was frozen in terror. The sight of the armed men had paralyzed them. "I said move," Thorin yelled. The team leader ignored Thorin. He wasn't looking at the monitor. He was scanning the faces of the terrified nurses huddled near the nurses' station. His eyes darted with frantic precision until they locked onto a figure, standing perfectly still in the shadows near the supply closet. Abigail Foster. She wasn't cowering. She stood rigidly, her hands hovering near her sides, her eyes locked on the men. The mousy posture was entirely gone. Her spine was steel. The team leader stepped away from the bleeding man, pushing past Thorin. He walked straight toward Abigail, the heavy tread of his boots echoing over the heart monitor. "Captain Mercer," Abigail said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a cold, authoritative baritone that Thorin had never heard before. David Mercer stopped 3 feet from her. His chest heaved. "We didn't know where else to go," he rasped, his voice cracking with a desperation that didn't match his lethal exterior. "They hit us at the safe house. Sterling found us. Sammy took a round meant for me. He's bleeding out, Cass. The military hospitals are too far, and we can't compromise the mission profile." Thorin watched, stunned. "Cass?" Abigail Cassandra closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. When she opened them, the ghost was gone. The operator had returned. She reached up, ripped the thick wire-rimmed glasses off her face, and threw them into a biohazard bin. She tore the scrunchie from her hair, letting the blonde locks fall loose as she strode past Mercer, radiating an aura of absolute command. She approached the trauma bed. The other 3 operators instantly took a half-step back, yielding the space to her out of deeply ingrained respect. "Move, Dr. Rivera," Cassandra ordered. It wasn't a request. Thorin stepped back instinctively. Cassandra didn't ask for instruments. She reached over, grabbed a scalpel, and plunged her hands directly into the blood-filled cavity of Sammy's abdomen. "He's lost too much volume. The femoral artery has retracted into the pelvic cavity," Cassandra snapped, her voice echoing off the tile. She looked up at the terrified nurses. "Brenda, stop staring at the guns and get me a Reboa balloon catheter, 10 units of whole blood, and a sternal IO drill. Now." Brenda jolted alive, sprinting toward the supply room. Cassandra looked at Mercer. "Did you secure the perimeter?" 2 men on the roof, 2 on the doors," Mercer said, standing over her shoulder like a guardian. Sterling's men are about 10 minutes behind us. Thorin felt the blood drain from his face. Excuse me? Who is behind you? Cassandra didn't look up from her patient. Her hands were moving with a blur of speed and precision that made Thorin's jaw drop. She was clamping arteries blind, entirely by feel, a skill only the most elite combat medics possessed. Dr. Rivera, Cassandra said, her tone deadpan as she clamped the bleeder and finally looked up at him. You've been wondering about my resume. Consider this the practical exam. Now, scrub in. I need you to repair this pelvic floor while I keep him alive, because in about 10 minutes, this hospital is going to become a war zone. The Reboa balloon, resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta, was a desperation move designed to temporarily cut off blood flow to the lower half of the body to prevent a patient from bleeding out. In a sterile, fully staffed operating theater, it was a high-risk procedure. In a chaotic ER bay, under the flickering hum of a diesel generator, it was practically a Hail Mary. Cassandra Hayes didn't rely on miracles. She relied on muscle memory and anatomical geometry. Catheter is in. Inflating the balloon, Cassandra announced, her eyes fixed on Sammy's monitor. The erratic, dying rhythm of the electrocardiogram gave a sharp, violent spike, then stabilized into a weak but steady rhythm. We have a pressure of 90 over palp. He's bought himself about 45 minutes before the ischemia in his lower extremities causes irreversible tissue death. Rivera, get in there and clamp the iliac veins. Thorin Rivera, still reeling from the whiplash of his mousy nurse transforming into a commanding tactical surgeon, stepped up to the table. He didn't ask questions. He took the clamps from Brenda, whose hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the sterile tray. Brenda, look at me, Cassandra commanded, her voice slicing through the nurse's panic. Brenda's tear-filled eyes locked onto Cassandra's cold blue ones. You are going to be fine. I need you to go to the security desk. Tell them to initiate a code black. Total lockdown. Magnetize all the fire doors. Drop the riot shutters on the pharmacy and kill the main elevators. Go. Brenda nodded frantically and bolted. Mercer, Cassandra said, not looking up as she suctioned pooling blood from Sammy's abdominal cavity. Talk to me. Who did Sterling send? Captain David Mercer stood by the sliding doors, his HK-416 rifle raised at a low ready, scanning the dark parking lot through the rain-streaked glass. It's his personal retrieval element. They hit the safe house with suppressed weapons and thermobaric charges. Professionals, ex-military contractors, mostly former Chechen and South African paramilitaries. At least 12 shooters. Comms? Cassandra asked. Jammed, muttered one of the other operators. A wiry sniper named Hayes no relation, who was currently barricading the triage desk with overturned vending machines. They popped a localized signal jammer the second they breached the perimeter. Cell phones are bricks. Hospital landlines are dead. We're on an island, Cass. Thorin looked up, his surgical mask catching the splatter of Sammy's blood. They can't just lay siege to a hospital in the middle of Seattle. The police won't know what's happening until it's over, Cassandra interrupted coldly. A localized jammer means dispatch isn't getting any 911 calls from this block. With the storm knocking out power grids, the city will just assume our lines are down due to the weather. Sterling chose this window perfectly. The sound of shattering glass echoed from the east wing. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, heavy crunch of a breach charge, blowing the reinforced glass of the outpatient clinic doors. East wing entrance. Mercer barked into his localized tactical headset, the short-range radio frequency still functional between the team. Jackson, hold the corridor. Give them nothing. Copy that, Cap, came the static-laced reply from the operator who had taken up a position down the hall. Cassandra tied off a final suture on Sammy's severed artery. She stripped off her bloody gloves, her mind shifting gears from trauma medic to combat tactician. She turned to Mercer. Give me a sidearm. Mercer didn't hesitate. He unclipped the Sig Sauer M17 from his drop leg holster and handed it to her. along with 2 spare magazines. Cassandra checked the chamber, the metallic clack echoing sharply in the trauma bay. She slid the magazines into the deep pockets of her scrubs. "Dr. Rivera, he's stabilized for now," Cassandra said, turning to Thorin. "Do not move him. Do not leave this bay. I am going to turn off the lights in this section. If anyone comes through those doors who isn't wearing charcoal gray, you get down on the floor and you do not make a sound." "Where are you going?" Thorin asked, the reality of the situation finally setting in. "To remind Sterling why he should have made sure I was dead in Ukraine," Cassandra replied. She stepped out of the trauma bay, killing the localized lights. The ER plunged into deep shadow, illuminated only by the faint, pulsing glow of the medical monitors and the emergency exit signs. Gunfire erupted. It was terrifyingly muted, the sharp, suppressed thwip-thwip-thwip of professional killers moving methodically through the hospital corridors. They weren't spraying and praying. They were clearing rooms. Cassandra slipped into the shadows of the hallway, her footsteps entirely silent. The mousy gait was gone, replaced by the lethal, predatory glide of a Tier 1 ghost. Sterling wasn't just a mercenary commander. He was a broker of secrets. 3 years ago, during the disastrous Operation Archangel, in the snowy forests outside Kiev, Cassandra hadn't just saved her commanding officer. She had ripped a heavily encrypted hard drive from the chest carrier of one of Sterling's dead lieutenants. That drive contained the routing numbers, shell corporations, and identities of a dozen high-ranking NATO officials who were secretly buying black market weapons from Sterling's syndicate. Cassandra was supposed to hand the drive over to the CIA, but when her extraction chopper was blown out of the sky and her team was left for dead by their own command, she realized the rot went deeper than she thought. She buried the drive, faked her death, and disappeared. Sterling had been hunting her ever since, desperate to retrieve the leverage she held. And somehow, tonight, he had found the ghost. Cassandra moved through the darkened radiology department. The heavy lead-lined walls of the X-ray and MRI rooms provided excellent cover, blocking thermal imaging. She could hear the distinct crunch of combat boots on the linoleum a few corridors over. She paused at the intersection of radiology and the pediatric wing. The fire doors had dropped, sealing the children safely inside with the reinforced magnetic locks Brenda had activated. But the mercenaries were moving toward the main power relays. If they cut the generators, the magnetic locks would fail, the ventilators would stop, and people would die. She checked the reflection in a polished aluminum crash cart. 2 men in matte black tactical gear, wearing panoramic night vision goggles, were sweeping the corridor 50 feet away. They were moving in a textbook 2-man diamond formation, checking corners with suppressed CZ Scorpion submachine guns. Cassandra didn't have night vision. She had the element of surprise and an intimate knowledge of Street Jude's layout. She silently unspooled a length of high-tensile medical tourniquet from her scrub pocket. She tied one end to a heavy oxygen cylinder standing near the wall and stretched it across the dark corridor at ankle height. Securing it to a sturdy metal handrail, she retreated behind the corner of the MRI suite, picked up a heavy, steel surgical retractor, and tossed it down the opposite end of the hallway. Clang! The 2 mercenaries instantly snapped their weapons toward the noise. "Check it," the lead man whispered in Russian over the ambient static. They moved forward quickly, their focus entirely on the far end of the hall, trusting their night vision to highlight any thermal signatures. They didn't see the black rubber tourniquet stretched across the black linoleum floor. The lead mercenary caught his shin on the rubber band. In a full tactical sprint, the sudden deceleration swept his legs out from under him. He crashed forward, his weapon clattering across the floor, his heavy armor slamming into the ground with a sickening thud. His partner spun around, confused for a fraction of a second. That was all Cassandra needed. She stepped out from the darkness, closing the distance in 3 explosive strides. She didn't fire the Sig Sauer gunfire, even suppressed would draw the rest of the element. She moved inside the second mercenary's guard, parrying the barrel of his submachine gun away with her left forearm while driving the heel of her right hand upward directly into his throat, in a brutal, crushing strike. The man choked, his hands flying to his crushed windpipe. Cassandra swept his legs, dropping him to the floor, and delivered a precise, merciless strike to the side of his head with the heavy steel frame of her pistol. He went limp. The first mercenary was just scrambling to his knees, reaching for the sidearm on his hip. Cassandra pivoted, stepping on his wrist to pin his arm, and pressed the muzzle of the Sig Sauer directly against the lens of his night vision goggles. "Where is Sterling?" she whispered, in flawless, icy Russian. The mercenary froze, his breath hitching as he looked up into the barrel of the gun. He recognized the voice. Every man in Sterling's outfit knew the legend of the American ghost who had slaughtered their Alpha team in Kyiv. "The basement," the man rasped, spitting blood. He went for the generator room. "He's going to kill the power and flush you out." Cassandra didn't hesitate. She struck him cleanly across the temple, knocking him unconscious, and stripped them both of their spare magazines, a tactical flashlight, and one of their radios. She plugged the earpiece into her own ear, listening to the scrambled Russian chatter on their encrypted channel. "Alpha 2, report. Did you clear Sector 4? A voice crackled over the earpiece. Cassandra didn't answer. She took a deep breath, her eyes adjusting to the absolute darkness of the hospital corridors. Sterling was in the basement. If he blew the main diesel generators, the ventilators in the ICU would fail within 20 minutes. The premature infants in the NICU would freeze. She keyed her own localized radio to Mercer's frequency. "David, it's Cass. Sterling is in the basement trying to cut the main power. I'm going down. Hold the ER. Do not let them breach the surgical bay." "Negative, Cass. That's a suicide run." Mercer's voice crackled back, tight with stress. "Wait for Jackson to fall back. Take him with you." "There's no time," Cassandra replied, already moving toward the restricted access stairwell. "If the power goes, hundreds of civilians die. I'm ending this. Now." She pulled open the heavy steel door to the basement stairwell. The air down here was thick with the smell of diesel fuel and damp concrete. Below her, she could hear the rhythmic, deafening thrum of the massive hospital generators. And then she heard the distinct sound of a heavy explosive charge being adhered to a metal bulkhead. Cassandra descended the stairs, slipping into the underbelly of Street Jude's, ready to face the ghost that had haunted her for 3 years. The descent into the basement of Street Jude's was like stepping into the belly of a mechanical beast. The air down here was entirely different from the sterile, antiseptic chill of the floors above. It was suffocatingly hot, heavy with the sharp, acrid stench of diesel fuel, vaporized oil, and the metallic tang of ozone. The cavernous subterranean level was a brutalist maze of thick concrete pillars, exposed water mains, and low-hanging ventilation ducts. But the most overwhelming element was the noise. The twin Caterpillar diesel generators, massive yellow monoliths that served as the hospital's beating heart during the blackout, were running at maximum capacity. Their rhythmic, deafening thrum vibrated through the soles of Cassandra's boots, traveling up her shins and rattling her teeth in her skull. The ambient sound was so absolute, so physically oppressive, that it rendered her localized radio earpiece entirely useless. It was an environment that stripped away modern tactical advantages. Down here, the fight would be won by line of sight, raw instinct, and the brutal geometry of close-quarters combat. Cassandra slipped through the heavy, reinforced steel threshold, the stolen Sig Sauer leading her field of vision. She kept her profile low, pressing her back against the damp concrete wall, using the massive, shadowed bulk of a deactivated boiler as cover. Her breathing was slow, measured, and perfectly controlled, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The mousy, invisible nurse of the night shift had been completely burned away, leaving only the apex predator of Echo 7. Through the shifting, strobe-like flicker of the emergency lighting, she spotted them near the primary breaker panels. 3 high-lumen tactical flashlights cut harsh, blinding arcs through the gloom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the heavy air. Set the thermite charges on the main axle. A cultured, distinctively British accent ordered over the roar of the engines. Once it melts through the engine block, this entire grid goes dark permanently. Then, we flush the ER. Sterling, even after 3 years, the sound of his voice sent a cold, violent spike of pure adrenaline straight into Cassandra's chest. She edged around the side of the boiler, peering through a gap in the rusted pipework. He was standing near the main control console, an island of arrogant refinement in a sea of industrial grime. He was a stark, almost absurd contrast to his heavily armored mercenary contractors. Sterling wore a bespoke, charcoal gray suit, likely lined with low-profile Kevlar, the jacket unbuttoned to reveal a pristine white shirt. A suppressed Heckler and Koch USP compact rested easily, almost casually, in his right hand. He was a man who orchestrated shadow wars from glass penthouses in Geneva, a broker who traded in state secrets and human lives with the detachment of a stock trader. Yet, here he was, standing in the sweltering basement of a Seattle hospital, personally overseeing the destruction of his greatest loose end. It spoke volumes about the sheer depth of the grudge he held against her. 2 heavily armed contractors were moving around the base of the massive yellow generator. They were methodical, entirely focused on their task, pulling brick-sized, clay-like explosive charges from their tactical pouches and slapping them onto the thick steel casing of the engine block. Cassandra's mind raced, processing variables at terrifying speed. She didn't have a clear, unobstructed shot at Sterling without exposing herself to the crossfire of the 2 contractors, who were both armed with short-barreled automatic rifles. If she engaged directly, the sheer volume of suppressing fire would pin her down, giving them time to detonate the thermite. She needed to divide their attention. She needed a distraction that was as violent and abrupt as the environment itself. She looked up. Running directly above the generators, suspended by heavy iron brackets, was a massive high-pressure steam pipeline. It was wrapped in fraying, asbestos-free thermal insulation, but a large, heavy brass release valve jutted out dangerously, slick with condensation and radiating a visible distortion of heat. She holstered the Sig Sauer, slung the stolen CZ Scorpion submachine gun tightly over her shoulder, and moved silently toward the maintenance scaffolding adjacent to the far wall. The climb was agonizing. She moved with excruciating slowness, testing every rusted iron rung before committing her weight, perfectly timing the scrape of her boots against the metal to coincide with the loudest cyclical surges of the diesel engines. The heat near the ceiling was unbearable, trapped and stifling. Sweat stung her eyes, blurring her vision, and the muscles in her back screamed in protest. But she pushed through the physical toll. She reached the grated metal catwalk directly above the contractors. She drew the CZ Scorpion, her thumb flicking the selector switch from full auto to single fire. She lay flat against the grating, her cheek resting against the warm metal, and took a slow, deep breath to steady her hammering heart. She didn't aim for the men. She aimed for the heavy brass collar of the high-pressure steam valve. Twip! The suppressed 9mm round sparked brightly in the gloom, striking true and instantly shattering the brass collar. The reaction was catastrophic. A geyser of superheated, 300-degree steam exploded downward with a deafening, high-pitched, shrieking hiss that overpowered even the thunder of the generators. The thick, boiling white cloud of water vapor enveloped the 2 contractors in a fraction of a second. They screamed a horrific, raw, and desperate sound that tore through the basement, vibrating with pure agony. They dropped their explosive charges instantly, their weapons clattering uselessly against the concrete as their hands flew to their faces, clutching at skin that was instantly blistering beneath their tactical gear. Sterling, standing 10 feet away, threw his left arm over his face and scrambled frantically backward, retreating from the expanding, blinding white cloud. His composure broke for a split second. He raised his pistol, scanning the catwalks overhead, his flashlight beam piercing the swirling vapor. Cassandra didn't give him a single second to recover or reposition. She dropped from the catwalk, It was a 10-foot free fall into the unknown. She hit the ground, landing perfectly in a shock-absorbing, kinetic roll on the slick concrete floor, just behind the heavy steel plating of the control console. Sterling's reflexes were terrifyingly fast. He tracked the blurred movement through the steam and fired 3 rapid, suppressed shots. Sparks showered over Cassandra's shoulders in a brilliant, stinging cascade as the bullets sparked off the metal console, striking mere inches from her head. "Cassandra!" Sterling shouted, his voice echoing over the hiss of the steam and the roar of the engines. He didn't sound angry. To her disgust, he sounded intensely, sickeningly amused. "I have to admit, your little performance in Ukraine was a masterpiece, a true work of art. But did you honestly think you could hide forever? A pediatric hospital, Cassandra? It's terribly cliché. You're practically begging for redemption." Cassandra checked the magazine of her Sig Sauer. 14 rounds. She stayed low, her boots sliding silently over the concrete, creeping around the right flank of the generators to outmaneuver his line of sight. "How did you find me, Sterling?" Cassandra yelled back, projecting her voice to bounce off the concrete walls, creating an acoustic illusion that made it impossible to pinpoint her exact location. "The drive is buried. I made sure of it. You'll never see it, and you'll never recover those assets." Sterling laughed, a dry, rasping sound that cut through the mechanical noise. "I don't need the drive anymore, my dear. I've already liquidated those assets. I burned those bridges the moment you vanished. I'm here for the principle of the thing. You cost me $60 million and a very lucrative, long-term contract with the FSB. I simply cannot allow a ghost to tarnish my reputation. As for how I found you, you really should tell your trauma surgeon to be more careful with his curiosity." Cassandra froze mid-step. The air in her lungs turned to ice. "Dr. Rivera, his little friend in Washington, ran your fingerprints through the NCIC database," Sterling continued, his footsteps crunching slowly, deliberately on the concrete as he hunted her through the rows of machinery. "A. Level 5. DOD ping. Highly classified. Supposed to be entirely secure. But you see, Cassandra, I have very expensive friends in the NSA. When that ping hit the Pentagon's firewall, a secondary alert was routed directly to my desk in Geneva. Your new friends handed you to me on a silver platter. Rage, cold, absolute, and utterly clarifying, washed over Cassandra. Thorin had compromised her, yes, but he had done it out of innocent concern. He had been trying to figure out who was standing beside him in the trenches of the ER. Sterling had weaponized that innocence to bring a war to a building full of sick children. "It ends tonight, Sterling," Cassandra whispered to herself. The words, a sacred vow. She reached to her waist and unclipped a heavy steel tactical carabiner from the dead mercenary's belt she had scavenged earlier in the radiology wing. She took a breath, judged the distance, and tossed it hard toward the far, shadowed corner of the room. It clattered loudly, a sharp, metallic ringing against a metal tool chest. Sterling whipped around, his flashlight beam sweeping the corner as he instinctively fired 2 rapid shots into the empty shadows. It was the opening she needed. Cassandra surged from her cover on his blind side, a silent, kinetic blur of motion. She didn't shoot. At this close range, with the adrenaline pumping and the lighting chaotic, a gunfight was a coin toss. She needed absolute, tactile certainty. She closed the gap in a heartbeat. As Sterling began to turn, the realization dawning in his eyes that he had been tricked, Cassandra was already inside his guard. She grabbed the wrist of his gun hand with both of hers, twisting it violently outward in a brutal joint lock, while simultaneously driving her knee upward with devastating force into his solar plexus. The USP fired harmlessly into the ceiling as the breath was driven from his lungs, the weapon falling from his numb, hyperextended fingers. Sterling gasped, stumbling backward, but he was no amateur. He recovered instantly, pivoting on his back foot and throwing a brutal, looping left hook that caught Cassandra high on the cheekbone. Her head snapped back violently. Stars exploded in her vision in brilliant white flashes, and the sharp, hot copper taste of blood flooded her mouth as her teeth cut into her cheek. She stumbled back a step, momentarily dazed. Sterling pressed the advantage instantly. He reached to his belt and drew a fixed-blade karambit knife, the curved, wicked steel catching the dim emergency light. He lunged forward, slashing in a vicious, upward arc, aimed directly at her throat. Cassandra stepped back, deflecting the strike with her left forearm. The razor-sharp blade sliced cleanly through her scrub top, biting deep into the meat of her forearm. Blood instantly welled, hot and fast, soaking the sleeve. She didn't register the pain. Her military conditioning slammed an iron door shut on her nervous system, taking total control of her motor functions. Sterling lunged again, stepping in for a lethal thrust to her abdomen. This time, Cassandra didn't retreat. She stepped into the attack. She parried the knife arm aggressively downward, sweeping her left arm over his tricep to trap it against his own body. With her right hand, she drew the heavy, scavenged tactical flashlight from her deep scrub pocket. Using the heavy, scalloped, steel strike bezel of the flashlight, she drove it with devastating, merciless force directly into the brachial plexus nerve cluster on the side of Sterling's neck. The impact was catastrophic. Sterling's eyes rolled back in his head. His entire right side went instantly, violently paralyzed, as the central nerve cluster overloaded and short-circuited. He dropped the knife, his legs turning to water as they gave out beneath him. Cassandra didn't stop to admire her work. She stepped behind his collapsing form, swept his remaining leg out from under him, and drove him hard into the unforgiving concrete floor. Before the breath could return to his lungs, she dropped all her weight onto him, pinning his throat beneath her knee. She pressed the hot muzzle of the Sig Sauer directly against the bridge of his nose, right between his eyes. Sterling choked, coughing up a fine mist of blood, but a twisted, defiant smile spread across his bruised face. "Do it, Ghost," he wheezed, his voice bubbling with fluid. "You pull that trigger. My men upstairs will level this hospital. They will burn it to the foundation." Cassandra's chest heaved, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood dripped steadily from her slashed arm, splattering onto Sterling's pristine, ruined collar. "Your men are already dead, or running, Sterling. You underestimated the home field advantage." She shifted her aim slightly to the left, angling the barrel just past his ear, and pulled the trigger. She fired a single round directly into the concrete floor, less than half an inch from his head. The deafening, concussive crack in the enclosed echoing space instantly ruptured Sterling's right eardrum. He screamed, a raw sound of pure agony, throwing his hands up to clutch his bleeding ear as his vision blurred with pain and vertigo. "That was for Ukraine," Cassandra said coldly, her voice devoid of any mercy. She stood up, her boots stepping over his writhing form. She reached down, ripped the tactical radio from his lapel, and keyed the command frequency. "This is Echo 7 Actual," Cassandra broadcasted in flawless, icy Russian, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a predator who had just broken the back of the pack. "Your commander is incapacitated. The generators are secure. If any of you are still on the property in 60 seconds, I will hunt you down myself." She listened as panicked. Overlapping Russian chatter flooded the channel. Without Sterling's leadership and the element of surprise, the surviving mercenaries were already breaking protocol, scrambling for their extraction vehicles. Cassandra tossed the radio aside. She turned back to the generators, limped over to the unexploded thermite, charges the screaming men had dropped, and kicked them safely into a deep drainage grate. The threat neutralized, the adrenaline finally began to ebb. Cassandra slumped heavily against the cold concrete wall, clutching her bleeding, throbbing arm as the Ghost finally reclaimed her peace. The flashing red and blue lights of 50 police cruisers, SWAT Bearcats, and unmarked federal SUVs cut violently through the pre-dawn fog rolling off Puget Sound. The torrential storm had finally broken, leaving behind a washed-out, shivering city that was completely oblivious to the war just fought in its epicenter. Inside Street, Jude's emergency room, the terrifying, claustrophobic chaos of the siege, was slowly being replaced by the methodical, heavily armed presence of FBI hostage rescue teams and local police sweeping the corridors. The triage area looked like a war zone stripped from a foreign conflict. Pockmarks from suppressed automatic fire chewed through the drywall. Shards of reinforced glass crunched under the heavy boots of tactical officers, and stark trails of blood painted the pale linoleum floors. Dr. Thorin Rivera stood frozen in the center of Trauma Bay 1, the adrenaline finally abandoning his system, leaving behind a bone-deep, hollow exhaustion. Sammy, the massive Black Ops operator, was remarkably stable. The Reboa balloon had held just long enough for Thorin to perform a miraculous repair on the shredded iliac vein under the weak yellow glow of emergency lights. Captain Mercer and his 2 remaining men stood guard at the foot of the bed. Their weapons were finally lowered, but their eyes remained hyper-vigilant. They were speaking in hushed, urgent tones with a man in a sharp, impeccably tailored suit who had just arrived via a black helicopter that landed on the hospital roof. Thorin realized he was entirely out of his depth. He stripped off his blood-soaked gloves, tossed them into a biohazard bin, and stepped out into the ruined hallway, needing air. He found her outside, sitting on the cold metal tailgate of an ambulance idling in the ambulance bay. The damp morning air clung to the hospital, muting the sirens in the distance. A bewildered, wide-eyed paramedic was carefully bandaging a deep, vicious slash on her left forearm. Cassandra, no longer Abigail Foster, was covered in a grim mosaic of soot, engine grease, and drying blood. Her severe, wire-rimmed glasses were gone, lost somewhere in the wreckage, and her dishwater blonde hair was a tangled, damp mess, falling freely around her shoulders. She looked utterly exhausted, her shoulders slumped beneath the oversized scrubs. But as Thorin approached, he noticed something else in her pale blue eyes. For the first time since she had quietly slipped onto the hospital's payroll 18 months ago, she looked at peace. The suffocating weight of being hunted seemed to have finally lifted. Thorin approached her slowly, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his white coat. He didn't know whether to address her as a colleague or a commanding officer. "Are you really a nurse?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost lost in the hum of the idling ambulance engine. Cassandra looked up at him. A faint, genuine smile, a real one. Not the polite, mechanical nod she usually gave touched her lips. "I have a degree, Doctor Rivera. I just acquired it under a different name, in a different lifetime." Thorin swallowed hard, running a shaking hand over his face. Guilt gnawed at his gut. "I'm so sorry. Greg, my friend at the DOD, he flagged you. Sterling told you down there, didn't he? That's how they found you. If I had just left well enough alone, none of this would have happened. You wouldn't be exposed." Cassandra raised her uninjured hand. "Stop," she interrupted gently, her voice steady and lacking any resentment. "You were doing your job. You protect your people, Thorin. You saw an anomaly and you investigated it to keep this hospital safe. That's exactly what I did tonight." She looked out toward the line of federal vehicles. "Sterling is in federal custody now, and his network is burning as we speak. You didn't expose me. You gave me the opportunity to finally stop running." Captain Mercer stepped out of the shattered hospital doors, his heavy boots echoing on the wet pavement. He walked over to them, his posture rigid, and offered Cassandra a crisp, deeply respectful salute. "Transport is ready, Cass," Mercer said quietly, his eyes softening just a fraction. "The agency cleaners are taking over the scene. We have a sterile bird waiting at Boeing Field. You can't stay here. The name Abigail Foster is burned." Cassandra nodded slowly. She slipped off the ambulance bumper, her boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. She looked at Thorin one last time, the ghost and the surgeon sharing a silent acknowledgement of the crucible they had just survived. "Take care of Brenda for me," Cassandra said, her voice dropping back into that soft, almost familiar murmur. "And Dr. Rivera? Next time you have a tension pneumothorax, don't wait so long to ask for the chest tube." With a final, fleeting smirk, She turned and walked into the dense dawn fog. Flanked by Mercer and his men, she disappeared into the shadows just as quietly as she had arrived. Street Jude's emergency room eventually returned to its chaotic, bloody rhythm, but the legend of the soft-spoken night shift nurse forever altered its halls. The shattered glass was swept away, and the bullet holes were patched. Yet the staff never forgot the night the shadows came alive. Thorin Rivera continued to save lives, though he never looked at a quiet, unassuming colleague the same way again, forever haunted by the terrifying grace of the invisible guardian angel who held the line in the freezing rain. She remained a phantom in the records, a whisper in the wind, and a stark reminder that the most lethal protectors often speak the softest. Saint Jude's emergency room eventually returned to its chaotic rhythm, but the legend of the soft-spoken night shift nurse forever altered the hospital's halls. The shattered glass was swept away, and the blood was bleached from the linoleum. Yet, the staff never forgot the night the shadows came alive. Thorin Rivera continued to save lives, though he never looked at a quiet, unassuming colleague the same way again, knowing the terrifying grace that might hide beneath a timid exterior. Cassandra Hayes vanished back into the ether, an invisible guardian angel, trading one battlefield for another. The world would never know the name of the woman who held the line in the freezing rain, prioritizing the lives of innocent civilians over her own ghost-like existence. She remained a phantom in the records, a whisper in the wind, and a stark reminder that the most lethal protectors often speak the softest.